In tonight's news edition, Egypt's presidential advisor says the people are more united than ever against the forces of evil after security forces clear the Fatah Mosque in Cairo following confrontations and exchange of fire with protesters of the Muslim Brotherhood. Both the Lebanese president and Hezbollah leader condemn Beirut's car bombing of Thursday and point the finger at Israel, saying the blast was similar with other Israeli attacks. And U.S. researchers employed a 13-story building in the state of California in a scientific experiment intended to map how the ground moves during a small earthquake. Good evening and welcome to the news at 10. Minister of Foreign and Expatriate Affairs Nasser Judi and U.S. Special Envoy for Mideast Martin Indyk discussed the ongoing Palestinian-Israeli negotiations following a round of talks in Jerusalem on Wednesday. Judi again reiterated Jordan's high interest in all final status issues and hopes for lasting peace in the region. Indyk said the U.S. is determined to continue cooperation and coordination with Jordan on peace negotiations and the settlement of final status issues. Separately, UN Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs Jeffrey Feltman briefed the Foreign Minister on the outcome of the UN Chief's visit to the Palestinian territories and Israel and his meetings with Palestinian and Israeli officials following talks in Amman with His Majesty the King. The meeting also discussed ongoing Mideast peace efforts and the situation in Egypt. Feltman and Judi stressed the need to support the US-sponsored peace negotiations between the Palestinians and Israelis. The Egyptian presidency advisor Mustafa Hijazi described the ongoing situation in Cairo as war, saying Egypt is not facing political division, it is facing war by the forces of extremism and will confront them with security measures within the framework of law. Speaking at a news conference in Cairo, Hijazi said the people of Egypt are more united than they ever have been against terror, violence and evil.
We're not only united towards a common dream, but we're united against a common enemy. We're united towards a dream of a civil, democratic, free state. And we're united against the acts of terror, the instigation of violence, and the powers of evil that are trying to cripple our move towards the future.
Forces cleared Al-Fatah Mosque near Ramses Square in Cairo following an exchange of fire with supporters of the deposed president. Gunmen had opened fire on security forces from a second-floor window in the Fatah Mosque, where hundreds of Mohammed Morsi's supporters have been taking refuge since protests turned violent. Although the Muslim Brotherhood earlier said it was committed to peaceful resistance to the army-backed government, a Brotherhood spokesman said this week that anger was out of control because of a bloody security crackdown. The Interior Ministry said over 170 people died in clashes across the country yesterday, bringing the death toll from 3 days of violence to almost 800. Meanwhile, Egypt's Prime Minister has proposed the legal dissolution of the Muslim Brotherhood and said the government is studying the idea. Prime Minister Hazem al-Biblawi made the proposal to the Minister of Social Affairs, the ministry responsible for licensing non-governmental organizations. Al-Biblawi was speaking after 173 people died yesterday in violence that erupted when security forces cracked down on Islamists protesting against the army's removal of Muslim Brotherhood President Mohammed Morsi last month. The Brotherhood was dissolved by Egypt's military rulers in 1954, but registered itself as a non-governmental organization in March in a response to a court case brought by opponents of the group who were contesting its legality. Speaking to reporters in Cairo, Al-Biblawi said there was no chance of forgiveness for those who had hurt Egypt.
There
is no reconciliation with those whose hands are covered in blood. There is no reconciliation with anyone who has raised arms against the country, against its people. There is no reconciliation with those who have broken the law.
Over to Lebanon. Lebanese President Michel Suleiman and Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah condemned Thursday's car bombing, which killed 27 people in southern Beirut, and pointed out that the attack might be related to Israel, as it was similar with other Israeli attacks. Suleiman said the detonation method of the attack shares some similarities with Israeli attacks. As to the attack, Nasrallah said Hezbollah will not fear terrorists and will never be scared by the power behind these terrorists. He further added that his party is much stronger. Although Israeli President Shimon Peres and the Foreign Ministry have denied any responsibility for the attack, many Lebanese believe the attack is related to Israel. The massive explosion in the southern suburb of Beirut killed 27 and left more than 300 people wounded. Meanwhile, Lebanon's leading politician and former Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri accused Hezbollah of dragging the country deeper into Syria's civil war. Hariri's comments came in response to a speech by Nasrallah yesterday in which he said he was ready to go to Syria himself to fight. Hariri wrote on Twitter that Hezbollah leader's speech takes Lebanon into deeper involvement in the Syrian fire, adding it's a pity to squander the blood of the Lebanese in such a way. Nasrallah had also said the car bomb in southern Beirut would only redouble the group's military support for the Syrian president. And on the ground in Syria, rebels are reported to have killed at least 11 people, including civilians, in an attack overnight on a checkpoint west of the city of Hims. The official state media described the attack as a massacre committed by terrorists. Activists and residents said some of those killed were from National Defense Army, which supports the Syrian government army. The checkpoint was used as an artillery base to bombard the rebel town of Husn, about 2 kilometers away, which lies below the towering Crusader castle Crac de Chevalier. Many Christians fleeing the violence in Hims city over the past 2 years have settled in the Christian villages around the area where Saturday's attack took place. Elsewhere, there are reports of rebel attacks on government positions in Idlib and Damascus, Adra town, 30 kilometers outside the capital, and other Damascus suburbs. Meanwhile, the UN Refugee Agency said an unusually large wave of Syrian families have crossed into Iraq's Kurdish region this week in a sudden movement across a recently constructed bridge. The new arrivals are temporarily sheltered at emergency transit sites, UN tents, and nearby mosques. The Refugee Agency seeks to open a new refugee camp in the next 2 weeks. We get more in this report.
Thousands of Syrian refugees pour into the Kurdistan region of northern Iraq on Thursday, taking advantage of a new bridge along the largely closed border. The United Nations said up to 7,000 refugees followed a first group of some 750 people who crossed the pontoon bridge at Peshkabur over the Tigris River. Most were families with women, children and the elderly, mainly from Aleppo and other embattled areas where fighting has intensified in recent months. There are already more than 150,000 Syrian refugees registered in Iraq, according to the UNHCR, which is urging Syria's neighbours to keep their borders open. The border between Syria and Iraq had been largely closed since Kurdish regional authorities shut the crossing on May 19th, though some Syrian refugees had been allowed in on humanitarian grounds. The bloody civil war in Syria, now in its third year, has driven nearly 2 million to escape the country. But the flow of refugees overall has dropped sharply since a peak earlier this year when up to 8,000 crossed every day into neighbouring countries, the UNHCR said.
As many as 100,000 people may be evacuated from their homes near Russia's border with China if the region's floods caused by a month of unusually heavy rain get worse. So far, Russian Emergencies Ministry evacuated about 15,000 people in the flood-hit areas along the Amur River in the Far East. Residents rowed boats past half-submerged houses and military vehicles dumped gravel to counter the floodwater. The water levels in Amur reached 6 meters, flooding villages in the Amur region and east of Moscow near the Chinese border in what is described as the region's biggest floods in 120 years. Water has swamped huge swathes of the countryside with 400,000 hectares of agricultural land submerged, causing potential damage of more than $60 million. Russian officials predict the floods to peak during the coming days and not start receding until early next month. In a scientific experiment intended to map how the ground moves during an earthquake, U.S. researchers outside San Francisco imploded a 13-story building to simulate a small quake. Over 12,000 tons of falling debris from the implosion was expected to create the effect experienced during a magnitude 2 earthquake. The building was located some 2,000 feet from one of California's most dangerous fault lines, the Hayward Fault, where fears of the big one are prevalent in the earthquake-prone state. The United States Geological Survey estimates there is a 63% chance of major seismic activity in the region within the next 30 years. Information stemming from the implosion will help engineers and architects to better design and build structure able to withstand a major earthquake, in addition to where to locate future development. High up in the Andes, near the banks of Lake Titicaca, an indigenous Aymara native could be the oldest living person ever at 123 years, if his records are proven correct. Carmelo Flores Lora, who believes he was born in 1890, lives in a hut some 4,000 meters above sea level in the small town of Frasquilla. He can still walk despite his fading vision and speaks no Spanish, communicating in the language of his indigenous ancestors. The Bolivian peasant has lived a traditional existence high up in the Andes from local fish, quinoa and beans, and a lifetime habit of chewing coca leaves. With no official state record of his birth, the Aymara native may not find his name in the Guinness World Records. According to Guinness, the oldest verified age in the world was French woman Jeanne Calment at 122 years. We begin with tennis and the Western and Southern Open in Cincinnati, Ohio. World number 1 Novak Djokovic and number 2 Andy Murray crashed out of the tournament. It took American John Isner 2 hours and 23 minutes to beat top seed Djokovic by 7-6, 6-4, 7-5. The US number 1 Isner, ranked 22 in the world, has been in good form on hard court surfaces with a win in Atlanta and a runner-up finish in Washington. He will face Argentine Del Potro in the last 4. Czech Thomas Berdych also cruised past world number 2 Andy Murray by 2 straight sets, 6-3, 6-4. Murray said he struggled to come to grips with the fast surface, but the 6th seed Berdych was always going to represent a tricky test for the Wimbledon champion, with the Czech holding a 5-4 advantage in head-to-head meeting, way to extending his hard-court winning streak to 13 matches. And Argentine Del Potro, the 2009 US Open champion, continued to sharpen his hard-court game before heading to Flushing Meadows, beating Russian Dmitry Tursunov 6-4, 3-6, 6-1. Tokyo is one of the 3 cities bidding to host the 2020 Olympic Games before a decision is made on September 7th. The Japanese city is the only one of the candidates, Istanbul, Madrid and Tokyo, to have hosted an Olympic Games before in 1964. Tokyo bid organizers emphasize the compactness of their offer for the Olympic and Paralympic Games, with 85% of the venues located within an 8-kilometer radius of the Olympic Village. Of 35 Olympic venues, 20 would be built anew, and of those 11 would be permanent additions to Tokyo's sports facilities. And finally, for a quick look at the weather. Moderate weather continues in hilly areas tonight, but it will be relatively hot in the Jordan Valley and Aqaba. Tomorrow, normal summer conditions prevail with northwesterly moderate winds, picking up at times and blowing dust in desert areas. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect hot weather tomorrow with a high of 39 degrees Celsius. Winds will be northwesterly moderate and the seas calm. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. Now our top stories, once again. Egypt's presidential advisor says the people are more united than ever against the forces of evil as Muslim Brotherhood protesters continue confrontations and exchange of fire with security forces. Both the Lebanese president and Hezbollah leader condemn Beirut's car bombing of Thursday and point the finger at Israel, saying the blast was similar with other Israeli attacks. And US researchers implode a 13-story building in the state of California in a scientific experiment intended to map how the ground moved during a small earthquake. With this we come to the end of tonight's news. I'm Rad Liptush. Thank you for watching and have a good night.